remembrance, I just want to spend a moment to not only remember the millions of souls who perished in the Holocaust. 6 million is generally the number that we give, but the truth is 6 million is a round number for an untold number of souls, and it doesn't even encompass the souls whose lives were shattered, whose families were gone and had to make their way through the world alone, who carry with them unimaginable scars. So 6 million is a kind of shorthand for a tragedy beyond human comprehension, but not beyond the mandate of remembering it and talking about it. And especially as we turn to the Torah, to remind ourselves again and again that the reason, in a larger spiritual sense, that this happened was because the Jewish people chose still for generations and generations not to abandon their tradition, and that's an act of courage that is awe-inspiring. And the world is richer for it, because otherwise we wouldn't have a Jewish people, and all the things that the Jewish people have accomplished would not be here. But the Jewish people themselves have suffered. And in this time when there is a genuine resurgence of anti-Semitic sentiment in the world, which is unfortunately something that we know. Now there's a car whose alarm is going off, but I think it'll stop soon. Now that there's a resurgence in the world, which is a phenomenon that we are familiar with, it is doubly important to remember this. And I want to recommend to you, if I can, I want to recommend to you a podcast that I listened to this morning on my walk, which is Barry Weiss talking to Imam Antelbi, I believe is his name. And he talks about, as an imam, about anti-Semitism in Islam. And he is articulate and powerful and courageous. And I cannot recommend this podcast highly enough. As you saw, those of you who were on the Facebook page, I recommended it on my Facebook page. On Twitter, it's very important and eye-opening. He grew up in Turkey, saturated with anti-Semitism. And it was just what he assumed about the world, that the Jews were evil. And every time he would see someone praying at the Western Wall, he would get a sick feeling in his stomach, because he knew those were the evil Zionists who wanted to do bad things in the world. And so he understands the phenomenon from the inside. And I won't go through the rest, but it's really his diagnosis of it, an explanation of it, and he's extremely articulate man. They're important. So I hope that you will listen. Okay. With that preamble, I would like now to turn to Mishpatim, which is this week's Torah portion, and the 20 begins on the 21st chapter of the book of Exodus. Last week we had Yitro, which were the 10 commandments, and the contrast is stark. There is the fire and the brimstone of Yitro, and then there are the particulars of Mishpatim. And I want to start off with one example of a rule in Mishpatim and explore that for what it says and what it means and what it has become. So it's a rule that's repeated 3 times in the Torah. Lo tevashel gedi b'chalei bimo. You should not seethe a lamb in its mother's milk. That is the way it's usually translated. Why not? And what implications does that have? So first of all, not seething a lamb in its mother's milk um, is generally taken to be an act of simple humanity. That is, you don't cook something in the milk of its own mother. And this idea is a reflection of the fact that compassion does not end with human beings, that it extends to the natural world. And there is, by the way, there are rather a number of regulations in the Jewish tradition. All of shechita, all of ritual slaughter, is an attempt to be kinder to the animal than other traditional methods of slaughter in ancient times. And this practice of not seething the lamb in its mother's milk is interpreted by many, we'll come to other interpretations in a minute, as just an act of essential decency, that you don't do that. Some of you may know that another explanation for why this practice has been adopted is that the practice of seething animals in their mother's milk was apparently a pagan practice, and it was a deliberate negation of that tendency in pagan society to practice this. There is another explanation that relies on the biblical wording and some parallel texts that interprets this actually quite differently and says, it doesn't say you shouldn't kill a lamb and seethe it in its mother's milk, right? Or you shouldn't seethe the lamb in its mother's milk, but rather you should not take a milking lamb. There's an article, if you're interested, on Torah.com, which is a good site that talks about the origin of this. In other words, when a lamb is actually drinking from its mother's milk, that's not a time to take it and slaughter it, which is another, again, act of kindness, to the extent that you're kind to an animal that you are nonetheless going to slaughter, but still an act of kindness and recognition of the boundaries that exist in nature and inside of our own humanity when we relate to nature. I say this, as many of you know, as a vegetarian, but I won't regale you too much with that right now, other than to say that we should be aware, sadly, not of, I wouldn't say of the immorality of eating meat. I don't think necessarily eating meat is immoral, but the way animals are slaughtered in our society in factory farming is unquestionably, to me, immoral. It inflicts unnecessary pain on sentient creatures. And 1 billion chickens a year who get slaughtered in this manner feel more accumulated pain than I think any other sentient pain in the world. So Judaism is aware of this moral question, too easily dismissed, of what it is to be a creature of God and to feel pain. Now, the interesting thing about this is, as many of you know, all it says in the Torah is don't see the lamb in its mother's milk. Now, it says it 3 times, but that's all it says. It does not say, and therefore you must have separate dishwashers, which a lot of people do, who are very traditional. And if they don't have separate dishwashers, they have separate dishes and separate silverware and on and on. That's what I grew up with. Some people use the same dishwasher and they'll run a cycle in between milk and meat. The only reason I don't have it is because I don't have any meat in my house. So I have more than one set of dishes, but one is for Passover and one is for the year. But I don't have a separate milk and meat dishes because I don't eat meat. And so there's no meat dishes in my house. However, the elaborate rituals surrounding kashrut of milk and meat are a product of this one verse. which reminds us that, I mean, the rabbinic explanation of this is it's a siyag l'Torah, it's a fence around the Torah. That is, these laws accumulate so that whatever the original prohibition is will never, never, never be transgressed upon. But it also accumulates its own velocity. That is, some legal things are like snowballs rolling down a hill, and they become more and more and more and more important as time passes. And so what was originally a fairly straightforward prohibition becomes a giant network of laws about what you can do in keeping kosher. And those of you who keep kosher know this is not a small undertaking. In fact, kashrut is a fairly elaborate, and that's not the only law of kashrut, obviously. The animals you can eat and you can't eat, the way in which they have to be slaughtered, so on and on and on. It's a fairly elaborate undertaking. And even the question arises, of course, now in our own day, how kosher are things that are like artificial shrimp or bacon or pork? And what if they're made in a laboratory? And so the complications are endless. And I don't have an answer for you this morning, but those sorts of ideas, and this is really where I wanted to come to, I'm now rounding back to the text. Those sorts of ideas are the things that are impelled by what happens in Mishpatim, where you start to get for the first time in the Torah, the breakdown of these are the various laws, and they cover a wide range of, how you treat your parents and how you treat a slave and how you treat, because remember that although the Israelites left Egypt, it isn't like they had no slaves in Israel. The question was, what does it mean to be a slave? Because they didn't have prisons then. You paid off your debt, often through slavery. So it was basically what we would call indentured servitude. At least those are Jewish slaves. Slaves that you capture in war, that's a whole separate question for another time. But all these kinds of laws, basically the foundational economic and social laws of the society, are elaborated in Mishpatim, because you can't live by the Ten Commandments. 10 Commandments don't tell you, like, if someone gives you too much change, you have to return it. You need more than that. And Jewish law is an attempt to catch life in the netting of the legal system, knowing always that there will be things that will slip out. But that's part of the reason why the law stays vital and alive, because you can never, ever, ever decide in advance enough of the law so that questions won't come up that people don't know how to answer. And to give you just one vast and fascinating field, medical ethics is currently one of the most vital fields of Jewish exploration, because how you define, for example, the criteria of death, end of life care, the question of abortion, all these are really vital questions. And so I wanted to say, I'm just pausing what Miriam says. The idea of a fence around the Torah struck me as contradictory to teaching that comes from Genesis, that you shouldn't build fences. Adam's admonition to Eve not to touch the tree, instead of repeating the actual prohibition not to eat of its fruit. Let me explain what Miriam is saying. In other words, the rabbis say making a law too stringent destroys it. I understand the contradiction you're pointing to. I would say it all depends how you build a fence. Some fences are useful and some fences are not. If you make the law, that's true, so stringent that people can't abide by it, then you destroy it. But if you make it in a way that sustains life, and sometimes fences are very useful and purposeful. I wonder, this is a little bit of a tangent, but it's a good tangent. I don't know if any of you know about G.K. Chesterton's rule about the fence. He says, if you decide you want to tear down a fence because it looks like it has no reason to be there, then you shouldn't do it. If you understand why the fence was put up, you really understand it, and you still want to tear it down, then you can tear it down. And that is this principle that before we get rid of social, religious, other institutions that look to us like they have no point, we have to deeply understand why they're there in the first place, because we may be destroying things that we're not even aware of. Sandy says that one of the central points of Mishpatim is the limit on human power towards each other and what we can and can't do. I think that that is true, although it also allows capital punishment. It also gives a lot of human power, but it's certainly, I think the entire Torah is a circumscription of what human beings can and can't do, following along with the Tower of Babel. It's like there are some things that human beings can do that they ought not to do. And certainly in our own day, when we are aware of the enormous power of human beings to create and destroy, this awareness of our power is important. No, Jason, I do not know about Israel TV, so I couldn't tell you. Now, Claudia raises a more central theological question. The Torah tells us you shouldn't add or subtract anything from what's written here, and the rabbis add a lot. They get around it with clever homiletic statements, but the truth is you cannot live solely by the Torah, even if you try to. There is a book, A.J. Jacobs, I think, wrote a book called The Year of Living Biblically, where he tries to live entirely by the prescriptions of the Torah. But you can't create a society that way. Because, for example, the Torah says you cannot do malacha on Shabbat. And it doesn't tell you what malacha is. So you have no choice but to interpret and to add and to subtract and so on. But it's also a fact that a living society, I mean, if you revived Jefferson and Hamilton and Adams, they would find all sorts of extensions and changes and adjustments to the law that they had never envisioned. Because you can't create a living society without this kind of organic growth and change. And that's one of the reasons, especially, by the way, especially after the temple was destroyed. And that was one of the reasons why the rabbis felt compelled, in order to save the Torah, to interpret the Torah. The part of the way that you keep things the same is by changing them judiciously, right? If you don't change them judiciously, then they die. And being over conservative in that sense, I think leads to a dead tradition. And this is, I mean, we have lots of dead traditions. It's not like we don't know. Whoever built Stonehenge, they were probably over conservative, and whatever the cult was, it just died out because it couldn't adjust to the changing circumstances of the world. And other forms of Judaism also died out for the same reason. So it is a balance, and only history gets to decide whether you got the balance right. That is, if you're still there, you got the balance right. If you're gone, then you got it wrong. The other part of this that I wanted to talk about is that, remember that this is also when Moses is up on the mountain. Because the last verse of Mishpatim is Moses went inside the cloud and ascended the mountain, and Moses remained on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So the chronology is a bit off. It's not clear. Like, so is Moses up in the mountain, he gets the 10 commandments, he goes back down, he gets upset, breaks the commandments, goes back up, gets new commandments, goes down and back up again, is up there the whole time. Moses's individual journey is in some ways as gripping and interesting as the instruction to the people, and obviously intertwined with it. But whatever Moses' journey is, the shape of the Jewish tradition is really being cast here. I have mentioned before that in this, Islam and Judaism are far more similar than either one is to Christianity. And the reason that that is so is they're both traditions of law. The reason that they're traditions of law in their core, I mean, obviously Christianity has a lot of law, it has canon law and so on, but the reasons that they're law in their core is because they're building societies in the desert. So you need civil law in order for people to function. Christianity came along during the Roman Empire when civil law was already settled. The Roman courts, they were already there. So Jesus didn't have to tell you what the penalty was for stealing an ox, because the Romans told you what the penalty was for stealing an ox. Instead, Jesus spoke internally, what religion was inside your heart, and interpersonally, how you treat your neighbor. Judaism had to teach that and much, much more because it was establishing it in the desert. And that's why Mishpatim is very much like the Quran and the Hadith and the Talmud, all these grappling with law in order to enable a society to be created and survive, because they're about to go into the land, and there they actually have to make a social arrangement where all these questions are going to come to be. Not only what can you eat, not only how do you pray, but what happens if your neighbor trespasses your boundary, or kills your animal, or does it inadvertently. And in fact, one of the innovations that happens from Mishpatim is the question of accidental death, and what's the punishment for accidental death. Like, I'm swinging my axe and the head flies off and kills you. And the Arei Miklat, the cities of refuge, are cities to which I can flee if I've committed involuntary manslaughter, basically, and I can stay there and you can't come get me. And so those kinds of arrangements, which are necessary in the absence of a modern judicial system and state, and sometimes would help even now, are encoded in the Torah. Because remember that in order for a justice system to work, the individual must give up his or her right for revenge. If you wound me or hurt someone I love, the natural impulse is to get you back, right? But the whole point of a justice system is that you're not allowed to do that. You have to rely on the justice system to do it for you. And sometimes it won't work, and you'll feel cheated, and you'll think the result is unjust, and you'll have to live with that. But that's what it means to give over your individual agency for revenge to a larger system. Let me see yes, thank you. What Henry said on YouTube is exactly right, which is that even the Karaites who tried to stay strictly by the word of the Torah found themselves developing an oral tradition, because you just can't do it. Literalists can't live literally. That reality strikes again and again and again in American law and Jewish law, and I'm sure in other legal systems of which I have no knowledge, but this is a human characteristic, so I feel fairly confident that this is a universal law. You cannot live solely by the letter of the law, and part of the reason that you can't, which is really important to say, because this goes to the heart of Torah interpretation, is language is never unambiguous. You can take any sentence and it can mean different things in different contexts. You know, the joke I've told many times to illustrate this is the guy who walks by the dry cleaning store, and on the front of the dry cleaning store, there's a sign that says, "My name is Fink, and what do you think? I wash clothes for free." So he brings in his clothes, goes to pick them up a week later. Fink says, "That'll be $20." So what do you mean that'll be $20? I read the sign. It says, "My name is Fink, and what do you think? I wash clothes for free." And Fink goes, "No, you didn't read it right. It's my name is Fink, and what do you think? I wash clothes for free." And that idea that even an intonation, a change of punctuation, and remember the Torah doesn't have any punctuation. I mean, even the Masoretic notes were added later. All of that can change the way we see things. I have been amazed, but not amazed, at people who come to me afterwards and say, "I'm sorry. No, don't be sorry for Mishpatim is actually the section of the Torah that we read now. Every Torah, if I didn't explain it before, Gail, every bit of the Torah has a different name. It's divided up. Each book of the Torah is divided up into several different what are called parshiot. And you read that parsha Shabbat by Shabbat by Shabbat. So last week's was called Yitro. It's the part that contains the Ten Commandments, among other things. This week is called Mishpatim. So you cannot, the ambiguity of language is both its glory and its bane. And as I said, I've given sermons and had two people come up to me and gotten radically different messages from the sermon, because what you hear and what someone says and what they think they said and what you hear can always be different. And as you just saw, they will sometimes use terms that they assume are common terms, and they're not common terms. So I said Mishpatim, the whole world knows what Mishpatim is, which of course is only a tiny little slice of the world has any idea what that word means. So when you read the Torah, or even when you hear someone else speak, you have to be aware of the space that always exists in language. It's part of what makes poetry so powerful. It's the spaces between the words that allow the multiplicity of meanings, the beauty of being able to return to sentences, poems, books again and again and again, and getting new meanings, because you can't possibly get all those meanings the first time in anything that is textually really rich and filled and multi-dimensional. So that's part of the definition of a classic, is you read it over and over and over again, and you always get something new, but they're the same words, and yet words don't yield all of their meaning at first blush. You have to listen again and again and again. There's even a statement in the Talmud that somebody who studies 1,000 times is not like someone who studies 1,001 times, right? That each time you deepen yourself. And that's why you have to be back here next week for Thursday Morning Torah. Because someone who comes to Thursday Morning Torah just this week is not at all like somebody who comes this week and next week, right? Much better. Also, please join us on Shabbat morning, right here on Facebook, on YouTube, and even better, come to synagogue. We're all there. You can wear a mask for a couple hours in a synagogue. We're still masked. I hope soon we won't be. But we are for the moment. Nonetheless, we would love to see you, and it's awfully nice to have community. So until then, I want one more reminder that this is Holocaust Memorial Day, and I hope that you will take a moment in your day to remember the souls whose lives were taken far too soon, and the way in which that motivates us to dedicate ourselves not only to their memory, but to ensure, to the extent that we can, that such